Guardians of the B.L.A.D.E. by Adalene Martis. Chapter 13. Culture Shock. Therak sat cross-legged beside the tranquil lake that stretched out near the facility. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the still water, reflecting the wisps of clouds that drifted lazily across the sky. The distant forest framed the horizon, its emerald canopy swaying gently in the breeze. The scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of moss filled the air, mingling with the soft whisper of rustling grasses. His massive claymore rested horizontally across his lap, the weight of the blade familiar and comforting. Closing his eyes, Therak inhaled deeply, centering himself. The world around him focused sharply as he entered a deep state of meditation he'd honed through decades of practice. A calm washed over him as he became acutely aware of every sensation. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the subtle shift of the wind against his fur, the cool metal of the sword beneath his hand pads. In his mind's eye, he visualized the intricate patterns of his sword forms. Each movement flowed seamlessly into the next, a dance of precision and power honed over decades. He could almost feel the resistance of the air as he imagined swinging, the balance of the blade an extension of his own being. Slowly, he rose to his feet, the muscles in his legs coiling with controlled strength. Opening his eyes, he fixed his gaze on an invisible point ahead. With deliberate grace, he began his deadly dance. The sentinel's weapons sliced through the air with a muted whoosh, each arc precise and measured. He imagined enemies surrounding him, shadowy figures advancing with menace. He pivoted smoothly and deflected imaginary disruptor blasts with calculated swings. The sword moved effortlessly in his grasp, its considerable weight seemingly inconsequential. The only sounds were the whoosh of the blade cutting through the air and the gentle thud of his feet shifting on the grass. As his movements intensified, the kata grew more complex. Therak spun, the blade a blur of silver as he parried and struck. His senses were heightened. He could almost hear the hum of energy weapons, feel the twitch of his whiskers, the pull on his fur as phantom blasts directed his blade's defenses. The wind whipped through his mane as he rushed through the tall grasses and aroused the cries of alarmed birds. He pushed himself faster, muscles responding with practiced ease. The world narrowed to the immediacy of each motion, the twist of his torso, the extension of his arms, the grounding of his stance. But as he launched into a particularly demanding sequence, a sharp twinge shot through his knee. Therak faltered, a grimace crossing his face. He halted mid-swing, planting the tip of his sword into the ground to steady himself. The ache in his knee throbbed, a painful reminder of an old injury and the passage of time. Breathing heavily, he surveyed the serene landscape, a hint of frustration gnawing at him. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. Realization that he could no longer complete the kata at his former speed weighed on him. The memory of being called a grandpa echoed in his mind, stinging more than he cared to admit. A movement caught his eye. Turning, he noticed Nyra, standing a short distance away, watching him intently. Her dark fur gleamed softly in the morning light, her eyes inscrutable. Startled by her presence, Therak straightened, subtly shifting his weight off his aching knee. He struck a casual yet heroic pose, leaning heavily on the embedded sword while trying to appear nonchalant. "Hey there!" he called out, his voice warm despite hoping she wouldn't try to make him walk right now. He desperately didn't want to show weakness around her. To his relief, Nyra approached him, a playful smile curving her lips. "I guess the citation I read about you wasn't exaggerated after all," she remarked. "Citation?" he echoed, raising an eyebrow. She closed the gap between them and extended a data pad toward him. "I found this while inputting my crew bio for the AI," she said. Taking the data pad, Therak glanced at the screen. There, a younger version of himself stared back, a formal portrait in military attire, eyes steely with determination. Beneath the image was the official citation for his induction as a Star Sentinel. It had been years since he'd seen it. He began to read, the words stirring long-buried memories, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Captain Therak, then corporal, distinguished himself by acts of bravery during the critical battle on the plains of Sarona. Despite being outnumbered and under heavy bombardment from an Onuri cruiser in orbit, Corporal Therak, his rifle overheated and beyond repair, armed only with his blade, charged the enemy outpost that was directing fire from above. With complete disregard for his own safety, he assaulted the outpost containing the 201st Orbital Defense Battalion by himself. During the assault, he deflected withering fire from the defenders with his blade, utilizing the Imperial parrying wind technique. Unable to stop Corporal Therak's advance using disruptors, the defenders of the 201st switched to using explosives, successfully penetrating his armor and wounding him in the leg. Despite the crippling injury, Corporal Therak continued to advance, cutting down over 100 members of the 201st, capturing their commanding officer and forcing their surrender. His actions allowed his comrades to advance and take the position, ultimately turning the tide of the battle and securing the planet. Therak's extraordinary heroism and selflessness in the face of overwhelming odds are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his pride, his unit, and Ferran Katz as a whole. As he read, the sounds and sensations of that fateful day flooded back. The deafening roar of explosions, the heat of the melted ground as he sprinted across the battlefield while hell rained down from space, the metallic taste of blood and adrenaline. He remembered the weight of his blade as he slashed through the enemy lines, the sickening lurch when he'd been lifted by an explosion and tossed into a wall, the searing pain as he realized the AT round had torn through his knee, and finally the terror on the enemy's faces when his battle trance had driven him forward, despite it all. Therak's gaze lingered on the image of his younger self. The male in the portrait seemed almost a stranger, strong, unscarred, eyes filled with unwavering purpose. He felt Nyra's eyes on him and looked up to meet her gaze. "You are quite the warrior," she said softly, admiration evident in her voice. He offered a modest shrug. "That was a long time ago," he replied. "I'm not what I used to be." She shook her head. "I don't know about that. From where I stood, you looked every bit the hero in that citation," she said. Nyra shifted her position to stand beside him. She scrolled up the datapad until the image of him, young and dashing, was centered on screen. "Though I wish I could have met you back then. I wouldn't need you to cook for me. I would just gobble you up instead." Therak laughed at that. "That would have been nice," he admitted. He thought briefly of his childhood friend and former fiancé and the fight that would have caused. If he was honest with himself, back then he wouldn't have known how to handle a forward felina like Nyra, and probably would have run away. However, he enjoyed the fantasy anyway, and the thought of getting to spend 30 more years in her company. Together they stood by the water's edge, lost in their thoughts as waves gently lapped against the lake shore. A flock of winged creatures soared overhead, their silhouettes cutting graceful paths across the sky, as their sharp cries roused Therak and Nyra from their reverie. "How's your knee?" Nyra asked after a moment, her eyes flicking to his leg. Caught off guard, he tamped his foot on the ground and ignored the spikes of pain which shot through his leg. "Totally fine," he lied. "Oh, really?" she asked, her eyes disbelieving. He sighed, extending his leg and testing it. It's just an old injury, he admitted. Acts up now and then when I twist it a certain way, but it goes away quick enough. She nodded thoughtfully. Maybe we could synthesize some pain relief in the lab. That isn't necessary, he said gruffly. It's nothing I can't handle. Nyra looked at him thoughtfully. Therak, I was too harsh yesterday, she said. I was mad at you for not being grateful when I saved you. I thought you were running for your life. He winced at the insinuation that he'd flee from a mere bird. I wasn't running, he grumbled. I know that now, she said with a huff. She turned abruptly and started to walk off while she said, Anyway, the main reason I came out here was to ask if you'd be willing to teach me that meditation you do, but I can see you're too busy not being in pain to help me. She called over her shoulder as she headed back. Therak watched as she walked away, feeling humbled by her sudden frustration. Nyra, wait, he called. She paused for a moment in the doorway to the facility. That shot of yours the other day was remarkable, he said. I've never seen someone completely untrained shoot so well. I was really impressed, and my knee does hurt. I'm sorry for lying, so if you still want to learn, is there a specific type of meditation you're interested in? He asked. Nyra glanced back with a smile on her face. I'd like to learn something that can get my eye to stop twitching. It's annoying and... She placed a hand on her stomach before she said, The stress is bad for our cubs. Therak studied her quietly, a flicker of surprise crossing his stoic expression. Nyra rarely showed vulnerability, and it stirred something protective within him. After a thoughtful pause, he nodded slowly. I know just what you need, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. Come, sit here. She lowered herself cautiously onto the ground beside him, the weight of her pregnancy evident in her careful movements. Settling with a sigh, she glanced up at him briefly before quickly looking away. Thank you, she murmured. Therak reached out and cupped her cheek in his hand. You don't have to thank me for something like this, he said gently. Now close your eyes, breathe slowly and deeply. Match my rhythm. As the months passed and they continued their meditation sessions, a subtle shift occurred between Therak and Nyra. The fragile trust and hesitant warmth they had shared during those quiet, reflective moments blossomed into deeper, mutual respect. Tasks around the facility grew smoother, their cooperation becoming second nature as they prepared together for the imminent birth of their cubs. Therak made rugs out of pelts from the animals he hunted and laid them on the floor of Nyra's room. He also took great care with cub-proofing her bedroom and making sure anything that could choke little mouths was well out of reach. Therak knelt before the cabinets in her room, methodically testing the locks and latches on each one, ensuring they were secure. His large hands, rough with years of wielding a blade, worked with surprising gentleness as he tugged at the reinforced fastenings. He gave an approving nod at the last cabinet before rising to his full height. Stretching his back slightly, satisfied with his work, he reached for the communicator at his hip and pressed the call button. Nyra, what are you up to? He asked. Her voice crackled through the communicator, warm and slightly distracted. Just finished restoring full power to the medical bay and making sure the synthesizer is working. Now I'm about to go through all the expired medicine. Therak frowned slightly. Need some help? He asked. There was a brief pause, then her voice lifted. That would be very nice, she said. With a slight smirk, Therak turned on his heel and made his way toward the medical bay. The medical bay was one of the more well-maintained sections of the facility, even though it had hardly ever been used. The overhead lights hummed softly, illuminating a row of pristine medical beds along in the center of the room, each equipped with mechanical restraints that were for emergency stabilization during launches, rather than restraining patients. Along the walls, Cabinets of supplies lined the space, and in the corner of the room stood the facility's medical synthesis machine, a complex, sleek apparatus designed for creating medicines on demand. Its large cylindrical core pulsed with a faint blue glow, indicating that it was operational. Therak's eyes swept the room as he entered. Nyra was already seated on a stool beside one of the supply stations, a large crate of medication open before her. She glanced up as he approached, flashing him a grateful smile. "Thanks for coming to help," she said, her tail flicking lightly. "You're so considerate." Therak's chest swelled slightly at the compliment. He took a seat beside her, settling his weight comfortably. She handed him a box of various medications. "Check the dates," she instructed, tapping a bottle where the date was recorded. "Anything expired goes into the compound recycler in the synthesizer," she said. "It'll break them down into base elements, and we can use them for new medicines." Therak nodded, opening the box and glancing over the tiny labels, his large fingers surprisingly nimble as he sorted through the bottles and packets. He flicked several outdated ones into another box labeled Recycle. Nyra shifted in her seat with a soft huff, resting one hand on her stomach. "You all right?" Therak asked, his ears flicking toward her in concern. "Yeah," she exhaled, shaking her head. "I just wish I didn't have to go pee every half hour." Therak nodded as he continued sorting, carefully tossing an expired tin of antifungal cream into the recycler. "You know, I haven't mentioned this before, but you're the first person I've really been around who was pregnant, except in passing." Nyra's ear flicked in acknowledgement as she kept scanning labels. "Is it hard?" Therak continued, his voice softer. "Especially at night when you're awake and I'm not." His concern was genuine, his tone laced with the quiet sincerity that only she seemed to bring out in him. Nyra waved a hand dismissively. "I'm fine. I can take care of myself." Therak's brows furrowed. "I know you can, but that's not the point." She looked up, ears perked slightly. "You should wake me if you need something," he said firmly. "If anything feels wrong, or if you just—" He hesitated, struggling for the words. "If you just don't want to be alone." Nyra's expression softened and she lowered the vial she had been holding. "Therak." He shook his head before she could protest further. "I mean it, Nyra. Ask for help." Her lips parted as if to argue, but after a moment she let out a quiet sigh, nodding. "All right. If I really need something, I'll wake you," she said. Satisfied, Therak nodded and turned back to his work. Then Nyra suddenly jumped, letting out a soft wince as her hand flew to her belly. "Stars," she muttered. "They're so active all a sudden." Therak immediately turned, his ears perking forward. His heart pounded with excitement as he reached out and gently turned Nyra's chair toward him, kneeling. His hands, careful and deliberate, rested on her belly. When he felt the small but firm bumps against his palms, his breath caught. Nyra tilted her head. "You feel them?" Therak didn't respond. Without thinking, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against her stomach, his purr rumbling deep and strong. Almost instantly, the cubs kicked with enthusiasm. "Oh, they like that," she giggled. Therak stayed still, eyes closed, feeling the soft, rhythmic thuds against him. His ears twitched as he focused entirely on their babies, his breathing steady. When he finally pulled back, his hazel eyes shimmered with unshed tears. Nyra quirked a brow. "You're crying again." "I've never heard of a male who cries every time he feels a cub kick." Therak merely shrugged, rubbing the back of his neck. Nyra watched him for a moment before shaking her head. Confusion stuck on her face as she tried to decode the enigma that was Therak. Embarrassed by her stare, Therak returned to his chair and started sorting through the medicine again, sniffing from time to time, and pausing to rub his hands at the corner of his eyes. For a while, they worked in silence. The only sound was the clatter of pill bottles as they landed in the recycle box, and the soft, ambient hum of the facility. Every now and then, the synthesizer let out a quiet beep as it broke down compounds into their base elements, processing the expired medications for future use. As she sorted through another box, Nyra finally spoke without looking up. "Is this affection normal among Feron?" she asked, her tone casual. "I heard rumors that Feron prides are close, perhaps too close," she said. "But if I'm honest, I have no concept of what that looks like." Therak paused mid-motion, his ears flicking forward as he considered how to answer. He set down a bottle, exhaled, and leaned back slightly in his chair. "When I was young," he began, "my father and mother were always around. My father was swordmaster to the High King, so he was busy teaching students during the day. But every night, without fail, he would be there as we snuggled and groomed each other as a family." He smiled slightly at the memory, his gaze unfocused. "Even my older brothers, who beat me up during training, would groom me at night." Nyra stopped sorting, her hands stilled over the box, her ears pointing towards him with interest as she processed what he was saying. "I started sword training when I was 4, Therak continued, his voice growing more nostalgic. "It was hard, brutal, even. But every morning after training, my sisters would pick me up from the training grounds and take me to the ice baths. Then the sauna. Then they would massage me and purr for me to help my muscles heal faster. When we were done, we'd help my mother cook lunch for the family. Then it was nap time together, then afternoon training." Therak closed his eyes as the memories of those happy days threatened to overwhelm him. To say we were close is an understatement. Silence stretched between them. Therak turned back to his task, but after several moments of complete stillness from Nyra, he finally glanced up at her. She was staring at him, wide-eyed, her mouth slightly open as if struggling to find words. Her tail had gone rigid, and there was a look of something in her expression. Shock, certainly, but something else too, something raw and unsettled. What?" he asked. Nyra shut her mouth and looked down at the pill bottle in her hands. She fidgeted with it before huffing. That's not real," she finally said, shaking her head. "It can't be. You're making that up." Therak blinked. "Why would I make that up?" "Because no one does that," she said, flustered. "Grooming, massaging, purring, sleeping together? She cut herself off, scowling at the floor. "That's ridiculous." Therak's expression darkened at her accusation that he was lying. However, he took a deep breath, calming himself. She was his mate, not someone who was trying to goad him into a duel. She just didn't understand. "There's no reason to get angry," he told himself. He turned back to his work as he spoke. "I've heard it's not normal for Panthera males to stick around after getting a felina pregnant," he said. "So I don't blame you for thinking I'm lying." Nyra's jaw tensed, her tail flicking back and forth with agitation. "Some males stick around. I grew up with my mother and father together," she said, a defensive edge to her voice. "Oh, really?" Therak said. "That's nice." Nyra scoffed. "No. It wasn't." She tossed an expired bottle into the recycle box with more force than necessary. "I would have preferred if he hadn't stuck around," she said. "My life would have been much better." Therak hesitated, then nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry." Nyra let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, well," she muttered, shrugging. "Males make life terrible. That's to be expected." Therak quirked a brow, briefly wondering how many times she had rehearsed that line for it to blurt out in front of him. Her disdain for males made him curious about her childhood. It was clear that Pheron family life was completely alien to her, unbelievable, even. The warmth of what he described clashed too violently with what she knew. He didn't push the subject. Instead, he sorted out the last of the expired medication and dusted off his hands. "That's the last of mine. Do you have anything else for me?" Nyra glanced at his empty box, then tapped a claw against the table. "Actually, yes," she said. "I could use some swaddling cloth for the cubs when they're born. Find the softest, cleanest material you can, and tear it into long strips with the width about the size of your hand. Then bring it to me." Therak nodded. "Consider it done." He stood and turned toward the door, but before he could leave, Nyra called out to him. "Therak." He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. She hesitated, then crossed her arms, her tail flicking uncertainly. I don't think Pheron culture is all bad," she admitted. "At least the family part." She shifted, uncomfortable. "I may not understand it all that well, but I want to, so keep trying," she said. Therak stared at her for a moment. A slow, warm smile crept onto his face. "I will," he promised, and with that, he left the room. Returning to his quarters, he pondered where else he might find the cloth Nyra had asked for. Most of the good fabric in the facility had been used until it was ragged with holes. His eyes drifted to his closet, and a thought surfaced, a reluctant but resolute idea. Opening the doors, he gazed upon his dress uniform, still hanging neatly, and waiting for him to wear it, to receive relief forces that would never come. The uniform was a relic from his earlier days of service, primarily black with red trim, adorned with gold buttons that gleamed softly in the ambient light. The flat white collar lay crisply against the fabric, framing the space where his mane would rest. The shirt, which cut off just below the chest with the black material extending down the back like a short cape, and the form-fitting pants, held up by a sturdy clasp, all symbolized a time of purpose and pride in his life, and the hope he'd carried that one day he would eventually get to go home. Therak reached out, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the uniform. Memories flooded back the first time he had put it on after being commissioned. The swell of pride as he stood among his peers, the weight of responsibility and honor it carried. Sometimes, in moments of solitude, he would open the closet just to look at it, a tangible connection to a past that seemed both distant and ever-present. Above the uniform hung a small photograph. He took it down gently, gazing at the familiar faces of his old friends. They stood together, eyes shining with youthful camaraderie. A pang of nostalgia tightened in his chest. "Goodbye, my brothers," he whispered softly to the image. "Thank you for everything." With a deep breath, Therak carefully removed the uniform from its hanger and laid it out on his bed. The fabric was still soft, well-preserved despite the years. He knew that this was the best material he could offer for his newborn cubs, a piece of his history becoming part of their future. He picked up a pair of scissors, hesitating for just a moment as he looked over the uniform one last time. Then with steady hands, he began to cut, each slice through the fabric a farewell and a new beginning. He worked methodically, cutting the uniform into long, even strips suitable for swaddling. As the pieces accumulated, he folded them neatly, laying them into a metal basket. The once proud uniform was transformed, ready to serve one last time as warmth and comfort to his children.